So today we're going to be looking at this video about, is China hiding a massive death toll? I mean, this guy certainly thinks there is. And this video has over 1 million hits and a very high approval rating. And I'm going to do this because people were saying that I was crazy for actually believing the China data. This was just me being really gullible. So I want to take a look at this data objectively and see if it stacks up. Now, there's a short way of seeing in science if data is reliable or not, and that's if you can make testable predictions from it of things that you didn't actually know at the time. So back in early February, I took a look at the China spread data from about mid-January to the first week of February, 3 weeks or so. So here I've got some of the viral spread data. It's always difficult to know whether these reported figures are accurate because, you know, how good are they at diagnosing it at the beginning? Is there over-reporting, under-reporting? There are always significant question marks over how accurate these numbers are. But we're just going to go with it for the moment to get a rough idea of what we're looking at. Boom. So that's going to be our model data, and this is our actual data. Good. Boom. So this is what a 50% infection rate would look like, and it's actually not a bad fit down here, but it's a terrible fit out here. And from that, I got a spread rate of the virus of about 1.3 to 1.5. That is, the number of cases increases by about 30 to 50% per day. It's kind of hard to say that this would be China trying to downplay the virus at this point, because a spread rate of 1.5 would infect the entire planet in about 2 months. If anything, that wouldn't be downplaying the virus. That would be positively alarmist. If China were faking the data, they sure as hell weren't doing it to minimize the perceived potential threat. Now, by this time, China had also quarantined a city of about 10 million people. You know, a sort of total China-style quarantine. And again, this is not something you do if you want to downplay a threat. If anything, it's downright alarmist. So, about the time I was looking at the China data, it was just starting to go into a linear regime, you know, because they'd been in the quarantine for somewhat over a week at that point. Now, you know, to get an idea of what you might think real viral spread data looks like, we'll take a look at South Korea, who were also very much on the ball for getting on top and shutting down the coronavirus cases early. Let's take a look at their data, shall we? Well, in the first couple of weeks after you impose the quarantine, you go into this linear regime, and then a couple of weeks after that, it kind of tails off. Well, I made my video in early February when the China data looked like it was entering the linear regime, and ignoring a discontinuity where they changed how they counted how many viral cases they had, it's basically the same as South Korea. Now, bear in mind that when China put out this data, there were no other coronavirus outbreaks anywhere in the world. If China was faking this data, there would basically be zero chance that they were faking it to look like what other coronavirus outbreaks around the world would look like. And it did look like other coronavirus outbreaks around the world. So if China were actually faking the data, they faked it to look like the real data. And at that point, you've really got to ask yourself, what's your proposal here? That they faked an alarmist spread rate that would contaminate the entire planet in about 2 months, and they quarantined a city of 10 million to downplay how serious the viral outbreak was in China? At any rate, the prediction from all of this is, if you assume that the data is real, that the outbreaks that you're going to get in other countries are going to be more or less the same. There's going to be exponential growth at the beginning with a growth factor of 1.3 to 1.5. Then boom, a week or so after entering quarantine, you're going to enter the linear phase, and somewhat later, it's going to tail off. And bugger me, that's exactly what you see everywhere else around the world. I'm therefore continually left scratching my head with people like, ho, you're so stupid, you actually believe the China data. Well, yeah, that's because it hit all of the internal consistency checks and was actually used to make sensible predictions about other numbers in other cases of viral outbreaks around the world. And in China, the deaths lagged the cases by a couple of weeks or so. Again, exactly in line with expectations and exactly what's been observed in every other country around the world that's had an outbreak. So surely there must be some sensible argument as to why China is faking the data, right? You know, having reported this massive spread rate early on in quarantined cities of 10 million. Let's see what they got, shall we?
But the word from people inside China tells a different story. A recent article in Caixin magazine included an interview with a truck driver in the city of Wuhan on March 26th.
And you get stuff like this.
The driver said that he had loaded up 2,500 ash-filled urns and delivered them to a funeral home in Hankou district, and that he did the same number the day before. So that's 5,000 urns in 2 days from one funeral home.
Well, that should just throw up all sorts of red flags. You know, just looking for the internal consistency checks here. And, you know, if you just believe this, you probably really shouldn't be laughing at anyone else and saying, ho, you actually believed that, didn't you?
5,000 urns in 2 days from one funeral home. In one city, in a country that claims only 3,300 people have died from the coronavirus in the past 3 months.
I mean, let's just ask the first question. Who would build a funeral home that can cremate 2,500 people per day? Funeral homes generally are like hospitals. You build them for expected load. So let's get an idea of how big this operation to cremate 2,500 people per day would be. Well, let's start off with something simple. It takes quite a long time to burn a human body. In fact, I didn't know myself, so I look it up and it says 1 to 4 hours. But let's take 1 hour, which if you think about it, you know, to burn someone's body, let it all cool down, put them into urns, that's quite a challenge. But whatever, let's be generous and say it's 1 body per hour. So a single furnace could cremate 25 odd people per day. So you would need a cremation center with about 100 furnaces running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to do this. Indeed, I did some scratching around and it turns out this was a hugely popular story picked up by people like Time and this report from France 24.
This facility alone had 30 ovens for cremations, which would mean 570 incinerations per day.
Yeah, my Chinese ain't so good, so I'm going to have to interpret what I think this says. But if they've got it right, that that's what one funeral home alone has, then presumably the number at the bottom is the total for Wuhan, which means that the total for Wuhan would mean you can cremate about 1,000 people per day for the whole of Wuhan, whereas this guy here is confidently telling us, because a van driver said so, that there were 2,500 full urns being taken away per day from one funeral home.
5,000 urns in 2 days from one funeral home. In one city, in a country that claims only 3,300 people have died from the coronavirus in the past 3 months.
And let's just get this straight. You think that people are being cremated on this sort of scale? You know, that well, first of all, they have a crematorium that size, and that the hospitals are delivering thousands of people per day to these crematorium. They're running them 24/7, and in a totalitarian state that can control everything super perfectly and super secretly. But they somehow forgot about the van driver.
The driver said that he had loaded up 2,500 ash-filled urns and delivered them to a funeral home.
Look, I'm all for healthy skepticism, but that doesn't mean that just because someone's not China that you should believe this crap hook, line and sinker. I mean, this thing's got over 1 million hits and people love it. Meanwhile, if you scratch around a little, you'll find stuff like this.
New information leaked from mainland China exposes the CCP virus death toll is far greater than the official number.
China state media reported on March 26 a truck at one funeral home shipped in about 2,500 cremation urns on both Wednesday and Thursday.
Oh, so they were just stocking up. They weren't cremating 2,500 people per day. Yes, okay, I think I can see where this is going. So if you'd look at New York City and find out that they're digging mass graves, then you would clearly conclude there's a massive cover-up in New York City about the scale of the dead people. In fact, it's maybe a useful barometer. a point of reference, because Wuhan and New York City are both cities of about 10 million people. So let's see when they were both respectively shut down. Well, Wuhan was shut down at the very beginning of this viral spread data, when there were about 500 reported cases in the city. New York City was shut down when there were 10,000 confirmed cases in the city. So, looked at like that, 3,000 dead, mostly in Wuhan, looks about right. Yeah, I get it. You want China and the CCP virus to be the boogeyman. Fine, I got no problem with that. But you gotta present some facts that actually stand up in order to get there. And the simple reality is their numbers check out. Sure, I don't take the China numbers as gospel, but I don't take any of these numbers as gospel. There are all sorts of unknowns in these figures before you get to the question of if the state is fiddling the figures or not. And the simple reality is these numbers look about right. In fact, if anything, China weren't downplaying this in the slightest. Their numbers were sheer panic-mongering, and their actions were those of fearmongers, closing down cities. And in the end, it turned out that it was about right. Can you imagine what New York City would have looked like if they'd have shut it down when there were only 500 cases there? Or for that matter, what the American reaction would have been if they'd have shut New York City down when there were only 500 cases. But I recall arguments like this at the time, that only a totalitarian communist government would stamp on the freedoms of its people and close a city of 10 million over a few hundred cases of a minor flu that doesn't really kill that many people. America isn't like that. We like our freedom. We like to be outside. Maybe reopen the country by Easter. Christ, guys, please try to understand. A virus doesn't care about your tribe, who you think is lying, what you think is propaganda or not. If you want to understand a virus, you have to look at the numbers and understand the math. Or let's take another look at what can you get if you take this. Look, someone is preparing for a disaster. Therefore, that means that the disaster is bigger than they're telling you. So if you were to look at the UK and find out that they were building a mortuary just for Birmingham alone that could take 12,000 dead, well, you would obviously conclude that the British numbers are being vastly underreported, because it's only meant to be 5,000 for the country, and this is 12,000 for one city alone.
We're still talking about more urns on this truck in 2 days than the official coronavirus death toll in all of China in 3 months. This is a lot of dead people. I've given just one example from one funeral home, so I hope by this point you're thinking, something fishy is going on. What's the real death toll from the CCP virus across China? One way to cover up the death toll is force people to stay in their homes. Don't actually test them. If they die, they were never tested for the CCP virus, so they don't count in the official statistics.
Well, oddly enough, someone said that in one of my earlier videos. Apart from they weren't talking about Wuhan, they were talking about New York City. They were saying that people who were found dead in their apartments weren't actually tested or counted as coronavirus victims. And you can kind of see why. In the middle of a crisis where you've got a limited number of tests and limited manpower, what's the point of doing them on dead people when we've got living people we can use those tests on? And similarly, in France, there was all sorts of problems about, they weren't counting the deaths in retirement homes as coronavirus deaths. Sure, different countries have different ways of putting these numbers together, but these are sort of seasonal differences to the numbers. They're not going to affect, things by an order of magnitude or something. But again, if China did all of this, why did they make up numbers that turned out to basically be the numbers that everyone else saw everywhere else around the world? Or China was underreporting by a factor of 10 to 40.
That seems to be what's happening. This article in the UK's Daily Mail says scientific advisors told Prime Minister Boris Johnson that the number of cases of coronavirus in China could be downplayed by a factor of 15 to 40 times.
Well, depends what you're talking about now, doesn't it? If you've been watching this channel for a while, you'll know that after all these analyses that I've done, every bloody country around the world has numbers of confirmed cases that are 10 to 40 lower than the actual number. And there are various ways that you can do this, one of which was established using the China data, is you make an estimate of the number of people who are infected by knowing the gestation period of the virus and the rough mortality of the virus, which means that for every person who dies, there are somewhere between 5 and 10,000 actual cases. Look, can we just be a little objective about this? Just a little. China has a litany of human rights violations. I am in no way defending anything China here. It's got a history of stealing IP and some real dark Big Brother stuff with the Chinese people. But for me, the China data here hits every goddamn internal consistency check that you can throw at it. So is it really me here who is being gullible in believing this data? Or you for having the wisdom for ignoring this clearly fake data that allowed me to predict the danger of this thing when there were only 15 cases of the coronavirus in the US?